Committee will come to order. I want to thank the audience for coming. It's a sign of strength and tremendous support for this budget reform process, which is part and parcel to restoring fiscal responsibility in our nation's capital. To me, that is the overarching goal for all of us, is to rein in the deficit spending that's driving the unsustainable national debt, to reverse the curse that James Madison talked about. A public debt is a public curse, and the worst of its kind, he said, in a Republican form of government. We have to reverse the curse, but we can't do that with the current culture and the current process. And to my friend from Miami, I would just say, who's a businessman, a local leader, people are more important than process. And ultimately, as Tom McClintock has articulated, the people of this institution have to have the political will to do the necessary and now extremely painful things, politically and otherwise, to right this ship and put our nation on sound financial footing. But process matters. And if you have a broken process, you will get bad outcomes most of the time. Process is nothing more, in my mind, than a set of incentives. And incentives drive behavior. And what we need, to my ranking member from Pennsylvania, the Keystone State, is to encourage members to conduct themselves in a responsible way when it comes to this process so that we can get the right and responsible outcomes for the taxpayers. For 50 years, this week, 50 years ago, the Budget Committee passed what would become the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. For the first 25 years, it worked. The budgets were passed on time. There were joint resolutions signed by the president, and things were rocking along. The last 25 years, I would argue, it almost never worked. In fact, here are just a few lists of grievances. And by the way, these are bipartisan grievances. No party, when they had power and control of either chamber, has lived up to the responsibility of administering the process as it was intended. We rarely pass budgets. When we do, we almost never do it on time. Too often, we waive spending caps and sequestration, pay-fors, and other offset measures. And when we do, we often use gimmicky pay-fors that aren't real. And quite frankly, some of the gimmicks we use, Carlos, would land our citizens in the private sector in prison on account of accounting fraud. Half the time, we don't reauthorize programs before we appropriate money to them. Not exactly a best practice in responsible budgeting. Reconciliation, which is a tool to reconcile the gap between revenues and spending. A gap that today is $2 trillion, 1 year, more than all of discretionary spending. And in 10 years, according to CBO, it will be double that. And we will accumulate $20 trillion in 10 years, half of which is interest payments alone. Well, reconciliation was a tool by which this committee and Congress could close that gap. Well, guess what? Congress has used reconciliation a number of times. When Republicans had total control, when I got here as a freshman, and this recently when Democrats had total control, both of them used reconciliation to jam partisan bills through that only made the deficit worse. So they didn't use it for its intended purposes, but for its self-serving purpose. We hyper-focus on 30% of the budget, discretionary spending, and we rarely, Mr. Gimenez, give even 10% of our time to the 70% of the budget that is on auto spend. We call it mandatory spending, and that spending may be 70% of the budget today. It's 90% of the growth over 10 years. Okay. I think suffice it to say, as some of my folks back in West Texas would say, it ain't working. So let's figure out how we can put those incentives in place, and let's get to a point where the American people can have confidence that we are running the people's house and the people's business the way they run their businesses, their families, their local and state governments. It's just that simple. I want to thank Rudy Yakum. He's a rising star, a new member of Congress from Indiana's 2nd. And he's put a lot of thought into this. The first time I met him on the floor of the United States House, he informed me of his intention to do something about this broken budgeting process and about our spending problem and the national debt that is being driven by that spending problem. And we were able to recruit him to the Budget Committee, and I've asked him to be the task force chair on the Republican side to lead the efforts to reform this process and to work with members in other committees of jurisdiction and across the aisle to identify the best ideas so that we can bring a package to our respective caucuses, and hopefully we can pass it out of both chambers and take a 50-year-old process that isn't working and make it work better again for the American people, the people we serve. Lots of, I would say there's low approval and low confidence. The bar has been low, sadly, by the American people. I want to prove to them that we can rise to their expectations and be responsible stewards. So, Rudy, thank you for your willingness to lead the efforts on our side. I'm grateful for you, and I'm grateful for Carlos Gimenez and for the many members who will come today to present their ideas. With that, I yield as much time as my ranking member may need for opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a few thoughts. First, as you know, while there are a number of things obviously we're going to disagree on, as we've talked about a lot in hearings and then outside of hearings, we both fully agree that the budget process is completely broken. It has existed for a half century, and we are so far beyond the way it was originally designed to work that it's at the point where there is widespread bipartisan agreement, not unanimity, I'd point out, but widespread bipartisan agreement, both inside the Capitol as well as outside, that we need real budget process reform. And look, I'm a pragmatist. The reality is there's a Republican House and a Democratic Senate. If we're really going to achieve and make our mark to last not just a year or two, but many years to come, and fix this and have a permanent solution, it is not going to be a partisan Republican bill, even though I know that would be the instinct for any majority to pass. It's just not going to fly in the Senate and not going to become law. If we really want to fix this process, it needs to be truly bipartisan. Now, I know that we've had recently several hearings about a debt commission, and I appreciate, Mr. Chairman, your genuine passion for that. But I think it's great that we're getting into budget process reform. I think there's a whole host, even though I've talked before about skepticism I have about commissions, I have to say the one area where commissions, I think, have done good work, although they ultimately didn't get their ideas over the goal line, the one area where they have done good work is in budget process reform. You served on the most recent commission, the one in 2018. My predecessor, Chairman Yarmouth, served on that as well. There are a number of good ideas here that I know had bipartisan support in that commission 5-6 years ago, that I'm very interested in, and we've talked about some of them before, biennial budgeting to look at, several other things that I think are very much worth exploring. There's some help from the outside, some academics, again, both from the right and the left, and also nonpartisan, who I think can offer real value to us and focus on that. I also will say again, just as the chair has a great passion for debt commission, I have a real passion when it comes to reforming our debt ceiling. We are playing with dynamite. We can survive and have survived government shutdowns, even though they're costly. They hurt our GDP. They lead to lower job growth. CBO has documented every single one has led to an increase in the deficit. But we've been able to survive government shutdowns. We are not able to survive a debt default. So making sure as part of our budget reform exploration and work, making sure that debt ceiling reform is part of that is absolutely critical. Because while, and this has been the pattern over the last dozen years, while at the moment the debt ceiling isn't front and center, it will be back in front of us in almost exactly a year, about 13 months from now. So hopefully, and I would urge this committee that really over the next, of course we're gonna have the Christmas break and holiday break, but once we get back in January, I do think the work of this committee should really be dedicated toward widespread bipartisan budget reform, and look forward to working with you in that effort, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I want to thank my ranking member again for his leadership and the bipartisan sentiments and his rightful understanding that we have to do this together if it's going to be lasting. And I know you're sincerely committed to that, and I appreciate the thoughts that you've had on the debt ceiling and other areas. And by the way, Derek Kilmer and the former chairman from Kentucky, both Democrats, were committed with Steve Womack, who was one of the chairs of that super committee. And you're right, there were several things that we agreed to, and the Senate pulled the plug on it in the 11th hour, just like Simpson Bowles had the plug pulled on it in the 11th hour. Timing's everything. I think we've got a great opportunity. Now, from Indiana 2nd, and our task force chairman, the great Rudy Yakum.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm grateful for this opportunity to chair the task force and for your leadership on this committee, as well as our ranking member, Brendan Boyle. Additionally, thank you to all of my colleagues for being here today to share your valuable thoughts and insights on this critical issue. Nearly 50 years ago, Congress passed the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, which established our current process for funding federal agencies and programs. 50 years later, our country looks much different. In 1976, our total budgetary authority was $420 billion. In 2022, our total budgetary authority was $6.5 trillion. Congress itself looks much different today as well. We operate more often in divided government with much smaller majorities than we have historically. And all of these factors illustrate why it's important that we evaluate our budget process and determine what's serving the American people well and what is not. It's been over 25 years since Congress enacted all appropriations bills before the beginning of the fiscal year. This leads me to believe that changes need to be made to our process. The inability to pass appropriations bills on time has led Congress to passing continuing resolutions days, if not sometimes hours, before funding runs out. This continual funding chaos contributes to constant overspending, high inflation, and the recent downgrades of the United States credit rating. This does not serve the Hoosiers I represent or the American people well. I'm a businessman by background, and have seen firsthand how process design and adherence to such processes sets a business up for success or for failure. The budget process in Congress is no different. We need to thoughtfully and carefully evaluate our budget process success and its shortcomings and update it to create the best results for the American people. Committee member days are an important opportunity for our colleagues not on the Budget Committee to share their ideas and help determine the best possible solutions and how to address them. I look forward to hearing testimony today from my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to determine in working together to determine the appropriate reforms to the budget process that is set up for success, as well as working together to restore fiscal responsibility to our nation's capital. With that, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman from Indiana. And now we're going to move to the most important part of this hearing. It is a member hearing, and we're grateful because we know that our colleagues have other responsibilities and serve on a number of committees with jurisdiction separate and apart from budgeting. But I have talked to you, Carlos Gimenez, on the floor a number of times, and you're as passionate as anybody I know about righting the ship and fixing this broken process. With that, I yield to you 3 minutes, but I'm going to be pretty generous because, I don't know why we don't do 5, but we'll give you 3, and if you're on a roll, I might just let you keep going.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Ranking Member. Thank you for allowing me to give some of my ideas. I'm not a businessman. Actually, I was former mayor of Miami-Dade County. It's the 5th largest county in the United States. Had about $10 billion in revenue, 28,000 employees, and I was a strong mayor of Miami-Dade County, so I was the CEO. Budgeting is not hard. It isn't. Budgeting is how much money do you have, and that's how much money you spend. The hard part is how you prioritize that. And unfortunately, I don't believe in this, that since I've been here, that I've seen us really prioritize the money that we have. And so there is no silver bullet to the budgeting process that we have. The structural deficits that we have, there are no silver bullets. We need to look at a number of things. And I'm just going to give you some of the things that I did when I was the mayor of Miami-Dade County. I walked in on a $2 billion operating budget, and I say it's a $10 billion budget because it's more than that, it's a CIP, et cetera. But actually, the operating budget was somewhere around $2 to $3 billion. And I walked in about 20% deficit my first year. So what are the things that we did? One of the things that we did is we looked at the bureaucracy. And I don't think we've looked at the bureaucracy here throughout the entire federal government to see if we need all the people that we have and we have employed. And that's, I'm sure a lot of people here are not really happy for me to say that, but that's just the facts. Most bureaucracies have more employees than they actually need. Most bureaucracies have employees that actually create more work for other employees, not really doing the work of what's in the benefit of the people. And so I think we need to establish some kind of a panel that looks across the board at the federal bureaucracy and see where we can save money there. When contracts are approved by the administration, are they overly generous? All the pay raises, et cetera, all that costs money. So that's another piece. In terms of revenue, we have $3 trillion in regulations that we've piled on year after year, decade after decade. We should be looking at a regulation reduction panel. What will that do? Well, if we can reduce 1/3 of the regulations that we piled on over the last 10 decades or so, maybe that's $1 trillion back in the pockets of American businesses and American citizens. That will also spur growth and unleash American entrepreneurship. That will help us grow the economy, grow more revenue. And so that's another way to tackle this problem. And at the end of the day, we're going to have to make some hard choices. If you really want to balance the budget, we have to be frank with the American people and say we're going to make every effort to reduce the bureaucracy to the level that we think we need in order to run government. We're going to reduce regulations so that we can unleash American entrepreneurship and grow the economy at a faster rate than we project now. And then really look at how we can prioritize the things that this government should be doing. And maybe we're doing some things we shouldn't be doing. That we've taken on some tasks that really belong to the states or belong to counties, to cities, or government shouldn't be doing at all. And so those are going to be the tough choices that we have to make if we're going to be serious about reducing the deficit here.
Representative Gimenez, I have taken note of the bureaucracy challenges, the regulatory costs that affect growth, and just prioritizing, which is something we rarely do. We just plus up the last year's spending in a four corners omnibus spending deal. I mean, this is the first time I know in recent history where we've actually done effectively zero-based budgeting, because we've put a lot of pressure. We've had folks in our caucus expect that. We're not supposed to ask questions of you all, but I'm going to do it. I'm just going to ask you one quick question. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of work.
Yeah.
That we tend to avoid in Congress.
Yeah.
Did you yield, what kind of results did you yield in your last comments in terms of digging into the bureaucracy, prioritizing? I'm talking about as CEO
Yeah.
of the local government, Miami-Dade. What was the outcome of all that?
The outcome was that we reduced the workforce by 10% and didn't skip a beat. We also got concessions from our unions, labor unions, so we had a 10% cut. And by the way, when we got that 10% cut, I cut my own salary 50%. So I led by example. And so I didn't ask anybody to do something I wasn't willing to do myself. And then there were some things that we were doing that we didn't do anymore. And so we cut some services that weren't that vital, but for the most part, the services stayed the same or actually increased. Fire, police, those things that are important, the things that we have to do, garbage pickup, parks, et cetera, all those were untouched. But we were able to balance, because we have to balance. See, that's where also I find is incredible here. You don't have to balance here. Well, all state governments have to balance, and all city governments have to balance, and all county governments have to balance. I don't have a choice. The problem is we have a choice here. And if we didn't have that choice, then we'd be forced to make a lot of these decisions. One further question before I go, and thank you for indulging me. The CBO scores. Have we done an analysis of CBO scores in the past, and have they been accurate or have they missed the mark? Because I will bet you that CBO scores miss the mark every single time. And they don't miss the mark by being, we overestimated the cost of this. They always seem to miss the mark by underestimating the cost of things. And so, am I wrong with that, or is that something that you see, over and over and over again?
I can answer that. First, it's nice to meet you. Good opportunity to do this. I think a newer member, I assume, and haven't had the opportunity to work. I'm sure you support. I always say every year around this time, my idea is that Miami should be the nation's capital for 3 months a year, January through March. But
we can set that up for you. Don't worry.
The other 9 months, I would like it back in my hometown of Philadelphia, representing Independence Hall as I do. But in terms of CBO, I mean, the famous physicist Niels Bohr once said predictions are hard to make, especially about the future. So the professionals, the nonpartisan professionals at CBO do a wonderful job, but we should recognize just how challenging their job is. They have missed the mark on a number of occasions, but I have sincerely not noticed a pattern to them missing it. For example, in the 1990s, when you look at CBO projections that were made in the early to mid-90s, they badly understated what the growth of the economy would be. In 93, 94, they projected deficits and debts. They completely underestimated just the growth of the economy and the growth of tax revenue that would come with that. And at the same time, if you looked at CBO projections from 2006, 2007, they completely missed, as everyone did, the Great Recession. And their projections were that the economy would be much stronger in 2009 and 2010 than it ended up being. So I would say they've missed on both sides.
My question really wasn't so much about a particular year, it was about a program. So major programs, like Medicare, et cetera, Social Security, all the programs that really put us, in this bind.
Yes.
Were they underestimated at the time? I know Social Security was back in the 30s, but Medicare was like in the 60s and all. Did they drastically underestimate the cost in the future
It's a
to
good
America?
question. It's a good question. I think they are limited in their tools. We should look at, as part of this process, CBO's methodology, the tools they have, and transparency, quite frankly. Not saying it's not a difficult job, but I think I'm a continuous improvement kind of guy. So I think it's a great question on those major entitlement programs that are driving the spending side, and we'll look at that for sure.
It's water under the bridge, but it's something to take a look at, so that if we were considering any kind of major project, we'd say, hey, maybe we ought to add a factor to this, because it's always somewhat underestimated. And again, I thank you for indulging me past the
bet.
3 minutes.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
It's the way I like to do it. I'm getting all kinds of pressure and pulls and mean stares, but I love it, Carlos. I mean, you're taking time to do this. I appreciate it. Thank you. And the next colleague of ours is from Wilmington, North Carolina. If we can understand him with this thick accent, then he's going to, I know, contribute to this process. I'm going to ask Rudy Yocum to make his way up here to the captain's chair, and I know Ralph Norman had a comment. I'd like Mr. Norman to make a quick comment as we set up for Mr. Rouzer's testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, I would just say that there's nothing more important than getting prioritization, like Carlos said, and every dollar up here has got an advocate, and it's tough to get weaned from things that shouldn't have been. So, David, thank you for your comments and appreciate your involvement. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Norman. With that, Mr. Rouzer, welcome, and thank you for your ideas and comments. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Boyle, for holding today's hearing on how Congress can create a better budget process to help address the current state of spending in this country, including holding this institution better accountable for its actions that increase the deficit and the debt. So I'd like to suggest 3 ideas for the committee's consideration, and I'll be candid and say that these are just top-of-the-head ideas, but I do think they will help lend to a constructive debate. Number 1, a change to the country's fiscal calendar. Number 2, holding CBO more accountable. And number 3, an accountability mechanism for lawmakers on votes of major spending that increases our deficit and national debt. So first, I believe we should consider modifying our fiscal calendar to February 1 to January 31. According to the Federal Times, starting in 1842, the fiscal calendar was July 1 to June 30. It was later changed to the current October 1 to September 30 fiscal year in 1977. Ironically, from what I've read, both changes to the calendar were intended to provide Congress with more time to pass appropriations legislation to avoid continuing resolutions. Our current fiscal calendar and the executive branch's inability to effectively deliver the president's budget proposal to Congress on time are not conducive to the current fiscal year structure. Often the president's budget is not delivered until March or April. The House and Senate then have 3 to 4 months to agree on top-line spending, pass their respective bills through each chamber, and begin the conference process and just shortly thereafter. It's a system, quite frankly, set up for failure. Consequently, we often come back from the August recess and have to pass a CR, many times multiple CRs, which then lead to a bloated end-of-the-year omnibus or several bloated minibuses, as we call them. It can also lead to a very long and damaging long-term CR. So I recommend a February 1 to January 31 fiscal year. It allows the president to deliver a budget on the current schedule, gives the House and Senate the calendar year to pass their own bills with a conference report to be voted on following the holidays. My second suggestion would shift Congress from complete reliance upon the CBO in order to better establish a better projection of what legislation will or will not cost the U.S. Treasury. How many times have we seen projections that proved to be way off the mark once the law was in place? And let me put it this way, if we each had a GPS that more often than not provided incorrect directions, we would toss it immediately. But let me be clear, the intention of this idea is not to dismantle the CBO, but the intention is to state that perhaps we need other instruments for which we can evaluate the CBO and improve it. For the sake of time, I'm going to slip down here to the third suggestion, which I think is probably the most important. I suggest we have a mechanism of accountability for votes we cast that increase the deficit and debt. For every vote that scores an increase in annual spending over $20 billion, $200 billion over a 10-year window, and/or converts discretionary spending to mandatory spending, should require a subsequent vote of acknowledgement that by enacting such legislation, spending will add to the debt, requiring that the debt limit will have to increase. If a subsequent vote of acknowledgement is required by the House, following the passage of bills that add to the deficit and debt, which, by the way, could be conducted the same as approved in the Congressional Journal, members would further establish a more transparent public record of our acknowledgement that a bill will result in additional deficits and debt. Or conversely, the member could vote no and explain in the record why such member either believes the scoring is wrong or the increase to the deficit and debt is necessary, such as in the case of war or other national emergency. So those are just a few suggestions. I yield back. I appreciate the opportunity to share them.
Thank you, Mr. Rouzer. We appreciate your time today, and thank you for coming. The chair will now recognize Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Schweikert, thank you. Let me begin by saying thank you for coming. You've been a great champion of these budgetary issues, and I know you've got a chart there. And
Yeah, it needs to be a chart. Look, I'll do this actually fairly quickly because I'm a bit of a heretic here. Yeah, the budget process, the mechanisms, the complexities don't work. Fine. But that's not the primary driver of U.S. sovereign debt. Every dime, a U.S. sovereign debt from today through the next 30 years comes from two places. Its healthcare cost is number one, and this slide's already a year out of date. If you factor in the new interest rates, that top line could be as high as $130 trillion of borrowing over the next 30 years. Now, that's not inflation adjusted, but just understand, today, Social Security is number one. Gross interest is now over $1 trillion, so it's number two. Medicare now is number three. Defense is now number four. On the chart here is in 8.5 years, 9 years, Social Security has about a $600 billion shortfall. Even if you do what the left has suggested of raise the caps, a couple other things, in our best, we're working on modeling the math, it's still short. It still does not cover the shortfall. But even if you did what the left suggests of just raise all these taxes, you've now just taken away, functionally, you're now maximizing out your tax rates to, anyone, it's the concepts of the Laffer curve. You've maximized tax rates, you have no more capacity. And once again, healthcare is 3/4 of the borrowing over the next 3 decades. So almost everything people like me will come to this microphone and talk about of changing this in the process, doing a better job of this or that. Over the next couple decades, it's a rounding error. And that's really hard and really uncomfortable because the scale of the math is so difficult. A few months ago, the Joint Economic Committee Republicans we decided we would step on the landmine and talk about something we can do. I've tagged it. I'm going to give this to you, ask you to put it in the record, and who knows, maybe you'll have a staffer that will actually look at it. Chapter 3 of the Joint Economic Report talked about obesity in America. Turns out it's a few trillion, and if you add in some of the economic effects, could be 7 trillion over 10 years in savings and economic vitality and second degree, third degree, fourth degree effects. And it's also moral. If you take a look at some of the data right now, we may be about to enter into the 5th year of life expectancy in the United States becoming shorter. There's some data in there that shows one of the most powerful things you could do for income inequality for my tribal populations, rural populations, urban populations, actually is not transfers of money. It turned out it wasn't even education, though education was way up there. It was health. We are financing, and this is where I become a heretic, and I'm sorry it's uncomfortable, but we finance through nutrition support programs the way we do them, or the way we do agricultural policy, the way we do these things. You gotta look at the base numbers. We're making ourselves sicker, and it's the driver of the debt. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schweikert. The chair will now welcome Mr. Timmons. Mr. Timmons, thank you for coming today. You're now recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Arrington, Ranking Member Boyle, and members of the House Budget Committee, today's hearing cannot come at a more critical time for our nation's fiscal future. It is past time for leaders of our nation to come together and solve the tough problems we can no longer ignore. As members of this committee are fully aware, Washington has a spending problem. We currently have $33.8 trillion in debt. Our debt to GDP ratio is 122%, the highest it has ever been. Next year, for the first time in our nation's history, our interest payments on the national debt will be our #1 expenditure. Social Security will be insolvent by 2033, and our healthcare system is fundamentally broken. We spend twice as much as the average country per person on healthcare, and our obesity rate is 3 times the average, which does not bode well for our future healthcare spending either. Our fiscal situation is not the fault of a single political party or administration. It is the collective shame of generations of politicians who continually kick the can down the road and choose political expediency over what is right for the future of our country. And it is no secret why. Interest groups from both sides of the aisle have preemptively started political attacks alleging the other side wants to take seniors' benefits. This is false. If we do nothing, in 10 years, there will be a 23% reduction in Social Security benefits across the board due to insolvency. This is clearly unacceptable. The issue of the national debt affects every American, regardless of political affiliation. No one party, scholar, or economist can solve this problem. Either the fiscal commission is going to be successful or our country's doomed. A historically used tool to bring together the best and brightest to tackle the issues politicians are afraid to go near. By bringing together experts, economists, and representatives from both sides of the aisle, a fiscal commission will foster bipartisan cooperation, setting aside ideological differences to focus on pragmatic, long-term solutions. The structure is intended to transcend the political divide and elevate the public discourse. The creation of this commission is not merely an option, it is a necessity. Such a commission would be tasked with the critical responsibility of comprehensively evaluating our fiscal policies, identifying areas of inefficiency, and formulating strategic solutions to address the root causes of our escalating debt. As we all know, a root cause of our debt is mandatory spending. Medicare spending grew by 18% and Social Security spending grew by 11% just this year. These are vital programs and lifelines for millions of Americans, and we must strengthen and preserve them for generations to come without compromising the promises we made to our senior citizens in this country. This is not about sacrificing the welfare of our citizens, but rather about ensuring that these vital programs remain viable and robust in the face of fiscal challenges. Every day we fail to move forward with this effort represents a theft from seniors, those close to retirement, and future generations of Americans. If we are truly to address our nation's fiscal solvency, we must have serious and uncomfortable conversations about the true drivers of our debt. Establishing a fiscal commission will force this body to finally face these issues head-on rather than continually placing more and more of a burden on the American taxpayer. Again, I want to express my gratitude for holding this hearing today. It is a step in the right direction for us to come together and have a serious discussion about the need for a fiscal commission, its mission, and begin the process of restoring our fiscal solvency and securing our nation's future. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Timmons. And the chair will now recognize the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Kat Cammack, for 3 minutes.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of my colleagues on this wonderful, wonderful committee. Your work is crucial in charting a path towards fiscal sanity for our nation, so I thank you in advance for your work. Now, as we speak, the United States national debt is barreling towards $34 trillion. Our window to restore common sense to our federal budget is slowly closing, and we must act before our kids and grandkids pay the price for our government's abdication of fiscal responsibility. Now, as one of the youngest members serving in the House of Representatives today, I am infuriated. I am disappointed. I am very frustrated. The fiscal sins that have been committed in the halls today and continue on are going to be paid by me, by my peers, by my generation. It is millennials and Gen Zs that will pay the steep price for the lack of courage displayed by members of this chamber. Continuing resolutions are nothing more than lazy rubber stamps of previous year's spending and priorities that do nothing to course correct the devastating path that we are on. Of course, no discussion about our nation's fiscal health is serious unless we address the drivers of our debt, namely mandatory spending, which, as you and everyone in this room knows, is on autopilot. Without reforms immediately, we will never be able to honor the commitments made by this government to our seniors and those most vulnerable. It is a conversation that is a much longer one, but a critical one. That being said, I'd like to highlight a handful of proposals that we could implement immediately that would help restore our nation's fiscal health. 1, creating and implementing a structured national debt repayment plan. 2, realigning our budgeting process to start from zero, or as we all know it, zero-based budgeting. 3, including CBO scores on regulatory costs before they are implemented, not when they come off the books. And 4, passing a balanced budget amendment. So first, a structured debt repayment plan would be a crucial step in tackling the national debt in a meaningful and intentional way. We can no longer leave this issue to chance and just hope it goes away. Eliminating the deficit and balancing the budget would be obviously the first step, but executing the concept of a long-term structured debt repayment plan is largely ignored and could be the trick to getting us back on track. 2 variations of this proposal exist, but one that seems to work the easiest and make the most sense would be to peg principal payments of our national debt to a percentage of the GDP. This would allow for payments to ebb and flow amongst the cyclical nature of our economy and our revenues. My belief is that these payments would not be suggestions, but should be made mandatory, as we can no longer treat the fiscal health of our nation as a discretionary issue. Only under circumstances such as economic crisis or a declaration of war could these payments be waived. These waivers would be congressionally authorized and only by a supermajority of the People's House. Furthermore, realigning the budgeting process from our current status quo of year-to-year budgeting to a zero-based budgeting process is a no-brainer. Every year, we approach this appropriation process assuming that the previous year's funding levels are adequate and substantiated. We know that to be false. Including CBO scores on regulations is also a common sense step. Regulations have a $2 trillion annual impact on our economy in enforcement and compliance costs alone. We have no actual figures that demonstrate what the government pays in these enforcement costs on regulations. In fact, when I spoke with the CBO director, he said that they only score regulations when they come off the books as a cost savings, but no mechanism has been in place when they go on the books. And lastly, as I mentioned before, we should pass a balanced budget amendment. In Congress, we hold the power of the purse. And like any business, we must maintain a balance sheet where our costs do not exceed our revenues. We will have no path forward in paying down our national debt if we do not make these reforms now. We cannot garnish the wages of our children and our grandchildren. We have to take action immediately. I appreciate your work and this committee's work in exploring the ways that we can change the course of our budgetary process for the better and with the American taxpayers in mind first. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cammack. Chair will now recognize the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Nunn, for 3 minutes.
I want to thank the chair, Mr. Arrington, for his incredible leadership on this, as well as Ranking Member Boyle for providing a forum for non-budgetary members like myself to share our policy priorities with for this jurisdiction. Mr. Chairman, I also want to commend you for your committee on advancing a budget resolution for fiscal year 2024 that would reduce the national deficit by $16 trillion and balance our federal budget within 10 years. That alone is a step in the right direction. In my home state of Iowa, we operate with a common sense approach. Just like farmers, small businesses, families, we balance our budget and our checkbook at the end of every month, and so does my home state of Iowa every year when it comes to our budget. In fact, in the Iowa legislature, when I had the privilege to lead, we balance the budget each year when I served there. And it's something that I want to bring to DC, the Iowa model. The idea that we can balance the budget with a balanced budget amendment. The commitment that we will not spend more than we take in revenue. That we will not have unfunded mandates. And through the result of bipartisan leadership, both with our governor and our state legislature, we unleash the potential of every Iowan to be able to grow the economy, pay down our debt, and now serve as one of the best managed states in the country because of our fiscal priorities. My constituents sent me to Washington to bring common sense solutions to an institution that can't stop swiping the credit card and racking up our national debt. In Iowa, we have worked hard to live within our means, and I am dumbfounded by a federal government that refuses to take this priority seriously. While constituents must balance their checkbook to afford basic necessities, especially with an inflation rate at 19% increase since the pandemic, our federal government has failed to rein in federal spending. And I believe it's time to restore a sensible, functional government that works for the American people, not one that is irresponsible in using the taxpayers' hard-earned dollar. That's why in my first week of Congress, my very first bill was to introduce the Balanced Budget Amendment. This resolution would have prohibited the total outlay for fiscal years from exceeding our total receipts, i.e. more money coming in than going out. This resolution would also require the President to submit to Congress a balanced budget annually, not one bloated with partisan wish lists. Let's just look at the facts from the administration's proposal this year alone, Mr. Chair. Over the 10-year period, the President's budget would increase spending by $73 trillion with a T dollars, or 23% of our overall GDP, the highest sustained level in American history. It would increase taxes by $58 trillion, or 19%, also the highest in American history. The deficit under this proposal would also increase by $16 trillion over 10 years, or said a different way for our citizens back home, a $50,000 increase per American citizen. Let's not forget, this is in addition to the $100,000 each individual American household currently owes in the national debt, which currently stands over $33 trillion. So, Mr. Chair, as I conclude here, I want to highlight that Washington is sacrificing the livelihood of our children, our grandchildren, and national security of our great country to claim partisan victories for re-election. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle of this committee to support each of the individual constituents' futures in my district and yours by making Washington fiscally sane. DC must live within its means. It must recognize that economic success comes from unleashing the hard work of Americans, and we must also recognize that DC's primary responsibility is to protect Americans' national security. And this truly is the greatest national security threat we face. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the members of the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Nunn. The chair will now recognize Mr. Mast. Mr. Mast, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
I know this committee takes very seriously that we work within our means, work within the means of we the people. And one of the places that we consistently do not do this year after year after year, and the numbers bear this out, is with emergency disaster supplemental funding. Whether that be for a volcano, a wildfire, a hurricane, a flood, a tornado, something else domestically in the continental United States of America, or Alaska or Hawaii, or whether we deal with something abroad in Europe, war in the Middle East or somewhere else, we consistently, for whatever the reason is, we do not account for this. The 20-year average for the amount that we do not account for is $105 billion on average every year for the last 20 years. Some years a little bit less, some years a little bit more. I think this is something that needs to be accounted for as we're looking. If we're looking at, for example, the limit save grow. If the limit save grow was $1.4 trillion, then as we're accounting what each of the 12 individuals' appropriation bills should receive, that number should have probably come down to $1.3 trillion from $1.4 trillion. Why? Because year after year after year, we're spending on average $100 billion more, $105 billion more than what we account for. Personally, in my opinion, I think we should create a 13th appropriation bill that specifically accounts just for disaster supplemental appropriations, both foreign and domestic. I know this moves into the world of what goes with the disaster relief fund and what happens with state and foreign ops appropriations, but given that we're not accounting for this, I think it needs to be addressed. I'd like to see the Budget Committee address this. I think there's a number of ways we could do it, but to not do it is simply irresponsibility against the commitments that we've made, certainly as Republicans, what we campaigned on, which was strictly fiscal responsibility. We believe in it, we work towards it, and if we don't account for that at least $105 billion that we're spending every year not accounting for, then we're not really living up to the fiscal responsibility that we hope to meet. In that, I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Mast. The chair will now recognize the gentlewoman from Indiana, Ms. Victoria Spartz, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, my fellow Hoosier. I'll be brief, and I think this committee needs to do a very important job, and unfortunately, we are not. We can talk about balancing something. Congress hasn't even tried to balance anything for a while. Two-thirds of our spending is on steroids, recurring, because we're so weak, we're afraid to vote on it and really deal with that. And the rest of it, we cannot touch most of it. We cannot even pass appropriations bill. We keep increasing the amount of unauthorized spending for decades. So it's a very, very serious situation. Our growth in GDP will not be covering now even growth in interest, and how much debt has to be refinanced in the next few years at this interest rate and slow down in the economy. We'll reach soon the point where half of our spending will go on interest, just interest on debt. And that is going to be collapse of our economy. And the only way to solve it will be, if we continue punting these issues, it's double taxes on the middle class, because everyone here is afraid to reform anything. So doubling taxes in the middle class, which paid roughly about, if you add all taxes, 50%, now probably you'll get to 80%, will have socialism. And unfortunately, we had lots of discussions, lots of good things, and I appreciate your committee had hearing on that commission recently. There are a lot of good people here in the House, been working, and I think there are a lot of these proposals. I work with a number of people, and we try to reconcile the differences, but I think at least in the House, we do have some bipartisan support, but the Senate is in trouble, because Senate only cares about elections, power, and unfortunately doesn't want to deal it on a bipartisan basis. So I would urge my colleagues here, Republicans and Democrats in your committee, to start really thinking about our country and what we're doing to our country, and have at least a conversation. Our debt, our credit rating was downgraded just because we're even not willing. We're so weak and worthless here that not willing to have a serious conversation that will be destructive for so many people. And inflation will destroy middle class in our country, and opportunities for people on lower income and people on fixed income. So I think this is a very serious national security crisis. I think Budget Committee needs also look how we can reform. We did some reforms at the beginning of last century, then we did at the end, closer to the end of the century, but realized that it's not working. We're not budgeting here. We do a lot of presentations and hearing, but not really looking. And number one functions was given to Congress by we the people. It's power of the purse and power of war, because our founding fathers understood that's the only way American people can have accountability. And I think this is a very, very important thing that we need to try to move the needle, and I hope we'll have a bipartisan support and support of this committee, and I'd be happy to help you in any way I can, and I appreciate Chairman really leading the charge on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Barnes. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from the great state of Pennsylvania, Mr. Mike Kelly, for 3 minutes.
This has been done before. So I have a copy of the Simpson Bowls, but the cover on it was the moment of truth. This is from 2010. So that moment of truth in 2010 has long passed. We're long past that time. And to be honest about this, and listen, guys, I'm going to talk to you as a Chevrolet dealer. I'm not going to talk to you as a member of this because I've dealt with debt my whole life. I understand how it can be, and I know exactly where we are. You all know exactly where we are. The question is, do we have the political courage to do what has to be done? And I hear people tell me, this is all you've got to do. I say, that's a great idea. Are you willing to step up and do it? And the question is, well, let me make sure I understand what we're doing before we go any further. I did bring some charts today, and I know David always brings charts, but you know, we try to talk, and I'm at the dealership. I usually end up talking to people who are prospective buyers. 97% of what we sell is on time, and what I mean is there's a sales contract for that financial institution. One of the biggest things we have to understand is people's credit score. Now, when people talk to me about cutting the cost of operation, I don't use the figures that we use, like if we have $5 trillion worth of revenue this year, we're gonna spend $6.9 trillion. And people say, I have no idea what it means. I said, this is what it means. Somebody making $50,000 a year is gonna go out and spend $69,000 a year, and they, oh my God, you can't do that. Well, we talk about getting this in order. Do you know, of every single dollar that we take in, 73 cents of it is already spent. That leaves 27 cents for us to do something about, right? The mandatory is there. What is it? It's Social Security, it's Medicare, it's Medicaid, it's interest on the debt. So when people tell me you guys are going to have to get together and get this done, my answer is I absolutely agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. Which programs do you think we should cut? And the answer is every program but the one I participate in. We're talking about just not the courage of Congress, we're talking about the courage of the American people to understand where we are right now. Now, we can sit back and we can talk and talk and talk, but I'll tell you what, we are now at a position in 2010, let me just read from the preamble because this is what they said at that time. If we do not act now, the country will be lost. 13 years ago, trillions upon trillions upon trillions of debt increased in sin, and we've done nothing. This is not a criticism of the body, by the way. This is a criticism of a culture. We are a culture that likes to spend. The only thing that can rein in spending is strong management. Strong management comes from this body. I would just ask you, as you look at everything we talk about, do you have the political courage to do what needs to be done? The referendum, what we're going to have to do is going to be drastic, and it's going to cost a lot of people a lot of pain because they've been used to it. They've been used to overspending without any responsibility to covering the cost of it. Mr. Schweikert comes from the private sector, as I do. There's no way in hell I could run the dealership the way this business is run. There is no business in the world that can be run this way, not for a long period of time. Our size of our debt is unbelievable. This is a titanic moment for us because most of the debt is below the surface. You don't see it. But when we hit that, it's going to cause the country to go upside down. I really appreciate what you're all doing. Lloyd and I talk about this stuff a lot. Jodey and I talk about this stuff a lot. Politicians can't fix it. We can come up with policy. The question is, we need people with courage that are able to stand up and do it. So I would just implore you all, listen to what it is we're trying to do. We all agree on the same thing. Is there a moment of truth? Yes, there was 13 years ago. The one today is far more challenging than the one they had then. I don't think we've implemented any of what they did before. And I know if we start talking about cutting, our phones will never stop ringing. Our offices will be full every day with people who say, yeah, but you know, you can't. And the answer is now, if we don't, it's over. So thank you all. It's good to see you. See you later on today. But great initiative, great initiative. Let's see what we can do. Let's see if we can all come out of the huddle the same way, run the same play, and the same kind. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Chair will now recognize my friend from the great state of Montana, Mr. Rosendale.
Thank you very much, Mr.
You are
Chair.
recognized for 3 minutes.
Appreciate it. Appreciate everybody taking the time to organize this today so that we can help you. I appreciate the opportunity to testify. I'm here today not to talk about new legislative proposal or new scheme to fix our broken budget process. Instead, I'm proposing that Congress simply follows the law that it passed for itself 50 years ago. After decades of recklessness shown by Congress, America now finds itself nearly $34 trillion in debt. Our government's fiscal irresponsibility is the single biggest threat to America. As Congress continues to ignore this threat, the situation only worsens. Earlier this year, the U.S. debt credit rating was downgraded for the second time in a year. This is a direct result of our refusal to address our debt. If we continue this trajectory, the U.S. will have to spend 50% of our annual revenue to pay the interest on the debt within 5 short years. Mr. Chair, I'm not pointing fingers at anyone. I have made every attempt to assist in the reduction of our spending. I know how. When I ran my own agency in the state of Montana, I reduced my spending by 23%. When I had the authority to make the cuts, I reduced it by 23%. It does not require another committee. It only requires discipline from this body. That's what it requires. Continuing down this path for any longer is completely unsustainable and will cause never-before-seen financial hardship in our country. You can see it on the charts here. Everyone is bringing these charts in. We know what the numbers are. Deficit this year, $1.7 trillion. National debt approaches $200,000 per household. The national debt is nearly at $34 trillion. We just cannot sustain this. Since 1974, Congress has only passed the appropriation bills on 4 times. On time, 4 times. Congress has not passed the 12 appropriation bills by the required deadline at all in the last 26 years. No one can function that way. We need to simply follow our own mandates. And here it is. And we've heard some recommendations about how to change the timelines, but the fact of the matter is, if we followed this timeline and we produced the budget and then had the appropriation committees turn their work in, and they're prepared to do so, they're able to do so, they're capable, then we would be able to accommodate that. Although the Republican majority in the House took much-needed steps to reduce wasteful spending this year, I've listened to everybody come before us, but 86% of the proposed spending reductions were prevented on the House floor, not by Democrats, but by Republicans. So please, install a mirror in this room so that the people can look at themselves in the eye and see what is causing this problem. 86% of the reductions that we brought forward were defeated by Republicans. We struggled to get 75 to 125 Republicans vote for those reductions, time and time again. Even if we eliminated 100% of the discretionary spending, we would still be adding roughly $500 billion to the national debt each year. And that's all we're dealing with, the discretionary, call it $1.6 trillion, okay? If we eliminated 100% of that, we would still be accumulating $500 billion a year to the debt, every year. This unprecedented debt crisis means that going forward, Congress will have to take the tough votes to lower our debt and restore our country's financial independence. The apparent unwillingness from some in the Republican Party to act in the interest of the American people and pass 12 appropriation bills that spend within our means will only prolong and worsen the struggles the American people are facing every day. Additionally, we must address the mandatory spending, which has been on autopilot for far too long. And I know that the members that are sitting here agree with that. Americans across the country balance their budgets and ensure their spending is within their means. And it is past time the federal government does the same. Mr. Chair, I'm willing to do my part. This does not take another committee. It does not take another committee. It takes discipline. It takes commitment and public service that we all signed up to be here for. and that is to make sure that we preserve this republic. We can do it. We must do it. I am here just to say that I will help you do it. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for your interest. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale.
Mr. Chairman, may I have a 30-second comment to my friend, Mr. Rosendale? May I comment on his
Please do,
remarks?
you're recognized.
I couldn't agree more, and I'm encouraged and inspired by the passion of you and many members that it is discipline and political will ultimately that must prevail in order for us to turn the tide of this deluge of debt that's going to bankrupt the country, to put it mildly and succinctly. I would say there is one big advantage of a debt commission that is bipartisan, and here's what it is. I don't think there's enough pressure from the electorate in any district, in any part of this country, on Democrats and Republican members to come up here and follow through on what they say they're going to do with respect to spending in the debt. If we can have bipartisan agreement on the numbers and the projections, and we can sound the alarm together and have a national campaign that wakes everybody up to this, as Abraham Lincoln said, without public sentiment, you can do nothing. With it, you can do anything. We need more pressure from the citizens of our country on the knuckleheads here in Congress that just apparently live in a different world altogether. So I see education and awareness as a valuable outcome of a bipartisan commission. But you're right, ultimately, got to have the political courage. I thank you for your input.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Rosedale, would you like to sit behind this a little bit longer?
You just want to use my charts.
The chair will now recognize Mr. Good from the great state of Virginia. My friend, Mr. Good, you are recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our committee for holding this opportunity for members to come and talk about one of the, I would suggest, two greatest threats to our country, along with our open border. We all know that the budget process has been broken for a long time, and the American people are suffering the consequences. The days of no consequence spending are long over, with record inflation, 40-year high inflation, 20-year high interest rates, gas prices, grocery prices, housing prices, utility prices, just breaking regular income Americans. Congress has not, unfortunately, demonstrated the intestinal fortitude to approach the budget with the necessary resolve to cut spending, to rein in the bureaucratic state, or remain accountable to the established budget process, let alone think about addressing the mandatory spending disaster on the horizon. I find it just very interesting. So many of our members in the Republican conference even will say, gosh, it's not the discretionary, it's the mandatory. We got to go after the mandatory. And they don't have a willingness to deal with the discretionary, to earn the right, quite frankly, to reform mandatory spending. Currently, the national debt, we all know this, is at a historic high at $34 trillion, which equates to $260,000 per taxpayer, $100,000 per citizen. Interest on the debt has doubled under Biden, totaling $663 billion this past fiscal year. By 2027, it's projected interest payments on the debt are going to surpass defense spending. The national deficit this year is over $2 trillion. We're on track for a 12-month, $2.5 trillion. Worse, the Biden border crisis is costing us $150 billion annually on top of that, and yet assistance to Ukraine has topped $113 billion with no oversight for that, and we've got the president and the Senate Majority Leader asking for another $60 billion for Ukraine, and they don't want us to pay for it, have any offsets for that. You would hope that no Republicans, Mr. Chairman, would support supplementals without offsets, because that would demonstrate that the Republican conference, the Republican majority, doesn't take serious the greatest fiscal crisis we've ever faced that we're under right now. Democrats broke the bank last Congress by spending over $550 billion in the name of environmental justice. And the president continues to ignore the established process of checks and balances by putting forth 850 executive actions which have allowed his administration to unilaterally enact $1.5 trillion in additional spending. Congress must approach the budget process reform with a commitment to cut spending, a demonstrated commitment to do so. A couple of suggestions I would offer: my nickel plan, which should be included as a guiding principle for the budget process because it requires the federal government to reduce its budget by 1 nickel for every dollar that it spends annually, and it would balance the budget in 5 years. This upfront cut would allow the budget process to address the excessive spending enacted by prior Congresses. My Article 1 Regulatory Budget Act would help Congress account for and address the out-of-control bureaucratic state. It's nearly impossible to balance the budget when unelected bureaucrats issue costly rules and spend money without proper oversight. For this reason, the budget process must include a framework, like my bill, again, the Article 1 Regulatory Budget Act, that would require a regulatory budget detailing regulatory costs similar to the annual budget for taxes and government spending. It would ensure that all bureaucratic spending is accounted for in any future budget process. This tool would allow those working on the budget to have a comprehensive understanding of all federal spending, not just that which is enacted through regular order. Some additional reforms: the budget process should ensure that if a budget's not passed by April 1, then Congress is required to remain in D.C. until the job is done. We ought to also not allow the president to give a State of the Union address unless he's done his budget as required by the first Monday in February. We ought to change the requirement for the congressional budget resolution to include requiring a 10-year debt service projection. How are we going to balance the budget or effectively address the budget process if the debt payments are not adequately accounted for? We need to change the requirement of the congressional budget resolution to include a baseline and a target debt to GDP ratio. What's acceptable? What is our target there? And change the requirements of the congressional budget resolution to require a markup of the budget within 2 months of the president's budget being published. I'm proud of the work that our chairman and our committee has tried to do on this issue. I think that a debt commission is a good thing to do, but it's only as strong or as valid as the willingness of Congress to enact the reforms that we all know are needed. This is not easy, but it's also not complicated. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Good. I certainly appreciate not only your friendship, but also our shared passion for restoring fiscal responsibility to the nation's capital. I also want to thank our full committee chair, Chairman Jodey Arrington. As you well know, it's been 50 years since we have even looked at or evaluated or reformed any of our budget processes. I think this task force is an important step in doing that on a bipartisan basis, and doing so in a series of phases that allows us to get to a much better budget process that works not only for Washington and for the lawmakers, but more importantly, for the American people as we work together to restore fiscal responsibility. So I really want to take this opportunity to thank you for asking me to chair this task force as we go through and reform our budget processes.
Mr. Chairman, will you yield me 1 minute?
I will, at the discretion of the chair, I will yield you 1 minute. Yes, sir.
Well, you're the chair for this purpose, and it's a righteous mission, and it's a very important endeavor. 50 years, the results of the last 25 have been horrible, tragic, really. And while ultimately it does come down to now the party in power in the House, but both sides have just failed to live up to the discipline and political courage that's been talked about today. We don't have any more runway left. I don't know how much longer, but within this decade, I believe, if we don't change course in a meaningful way with respect to our rising deficits and unsustainable debt, we're going to lose the country. And we can't kick the can down any further. I think your leadership and the efforts of our colleagues under your leadership to make sure that the incentives are right to motivate us through carrots and sticks to get us to responsible budgetary outcomes to save this country is critical. And so you've come to Congress at just the right time. It was clear to me that you had the leadership skills and the passion and the respect from your peers to lead this charge. And I expect big things from you, not only in this endeavor, but in your future here in Congress. Thank you for your willingness to lead it, and I'm excited about the results of this and all of our efforts to restore fiscal sanity and our citizens' capital here in Washington, D.C., and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That completes the committee's business for today. I would like to thank all the members who shared their ideas and recommendations before the Budget Committee. We appreciate your perspective and feedback. The committee stands adjourned.